Today on Tactical Tortoise, we're going to be talking about BBWs. Beautiful, balanced warhams. What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're going to be talking a little bit more in depth about the US Open official Warhammer 40k terrain layouts that Games Workshop has previewed for us this week in this Warhammer community article. This has the potential to be a really big deal for the competitive 40k community since, I mean, anything official is bound to percolate into the rest of the community at large. So there's the chance that the layouts that are laid out here end up being used by the majority of the competitive community, or at least by some of the other very large super major level events that ITC is going to be holding throughout the year. So this is a big deal. This is really the first time we've seen Games Workshop come in with, you know, some more official guidelines about how they expect terrain to be set up, you know, over and above what's included in the rulebook, which is very vague. And it will be fascinating to watch how the competitive community adopts or adapts these terrain layouts. So let's dive into it. Now, before we get too far into the video, I do have a couple announcements to make. First off, the T5S2 Season 3 Invitational is taking place starting this weekend, July 2nd. We had over 600 players in the T5S2 series this season, a dramatic increase from last season, and the top 16 of those standings are going to fight it out to be crowned the season champion. These are 16 of the best and most practiced Warhammer 40k players in the world right now, so we're going to get some incredible games of 40k all throughout the week. I also want to give a big shout out to Tactical Tortoise patron subscriber Zachary, who asked me to give a shout out to his new battle report channel, Red Bluff Battle Reports. I'm going to put a link to Red Bluff's YouTube channel as well as their Facebook page down in the description, but they are getting into video battle reports live streams of games over on YouTube and on Facebook. They have some cool looking miniatures and a very professional looking setup, so good luck to Red Bluff Battle Reports, and I hope to see a lot more games coming out of them in the future. But with that, let's dive back into this MetaWatch article. We are finally getting a look at exactly what kind of terrain is going to be at these US Open events. For those who don't know, 3 US Open events have been scheduled throughout the remainder of the year. The first one being in August, the second one in New Orleans in October, last one in Texas in November. All of these are going to have a joint Warhammer 40k and Age of Sigmar Grand Tournament. I think they have 256 players apiece, so they're going to be big, super major level events and submitted to ITC as well. That's something I missed the first time I went through the rules pack for those events, but we got there. Now, in the original rules pack for the event, we had these diagrams, so we had a little bit of an idea of what we were going to be looking forward to on this terrain, but the diagrams didn't really give us much information. Obviously, the actual boundaries of the terrain is pretty nebulous. There's no measurements given, and while they described what would be on top of them, they didn't, you know, really offer any actual examples. That has changed now because we do have some actual photographs of the tables themselves, and they do talk about in this article, which is penned by Mike Brandt, about how they're trying to capture some aesthetic quality to the terrain as well, and we can see this is some very nicely painted up GW ruins. But essentially, what it looks like we're going to be expecting are, I think, what are 12 by 12 squares for the larger ruins. They mentioned that these larger ruins are going to be line of sight blocking, so these 4 ruins in the middle will have no windows or doors or things that could normally be seen through. While that doesn't mean that you can't see through the edges of the terrain at all, because as long as you're inside the obscuring terrain, true line of sight will apply. So if you can be seen through the crevices or the cracks in the terrain, then you'll be able to be seen. But it does mean that smaller units, especially infantry, small vehicles, stuff like that, will be able to enter into the buildings and will be able to hide with relative safety. The important thing to note, however, though, is that 18 wound models are probably not going to be protected whatsoever by this terrain. Things like Knights and Dimacarons and Mortarion that have those 18 wounds and are relatively tall are not going to be able to hide behind these little walls. The walls look to be maybe 5 or 6 inches tall, so those big things are liable to get Alpha Strike right off the board. Definitely something to consider if you're going to an event using this terrain, is that, you know, we're not using any WTC Ls, there's no Nova Ls, there's none of these big, huge, like 12-inch tall line of sight blockers that you can actually hide those big 18 wounders behind. Those are just going to be out in the open for people to shoot at. Now, they also talked a little bit about how these terrain layouts are going to be used. They mentioned that they understand that terrain isn't necessarily suited for every deployment style, which is good, but they also mention that they're going to be changing the terrain based on the day. So what it sounds like to me is that the maps might be used for any deployment style, and depending on the round you're playing, every one of those deployment styles will use the same map. So for example, if you have a hammer and anvil style deployment, so short table edges, you may use map 1 on day 1, but if you have the same style of deployment on day 2, you might use map 2 instead. That would be a little bit concerning to me because I definitely don't think that these maps are suited for every terrain layout. I'll talk about exactly why I think that a little bit later on in the video, but I do think that each of these layouts has 1 or 2 deployments that it's particularly suited for, and that the other ones it may be a little too sparse, which could create some problems. Now, moving on, they also talked about the balance of the terrain and how they wanted to balance faction power between long-ranged armies. The examples they give are Astra Militarum and Tau Empire, versus more melee-focused ones. I like that they give Tyranids as an example, because Tyranids tends to do a lot of its damage at range. But that's okay, GW. I understand that you might not be up to date on the current status of Tyranid technology. But one thing they do talk about is terrain making it easy for combat-oriented armies to cross the board. And I do want to touch on this point really quickly, because it does, I think, show a little bit of a misunderstanding of how terrain impacts games of 9th edition 40k specifically. Terrain essentially has 2 purposes in 9th edition 40k. A, it protects your models as they're standing on objectives. Because your primary objective scoring starts at the top of your turn, you have to be able to move models to an objective, then have them survive there for an entire round in order to get any points from that objective. That means that if you have no terrain on those objectives and no protection, your units are liable to get shot off immediately and you don't get any points. That gives the first player especially a big advantage because they're able to move up the table and engage first. Then when the second player moves up, the first player is already in a position to shoot the second player's models. Secondly, they're to protect you against alpha strikes. If your opponent has overwhelming range superiority and gets to go first, and if you don't have reasonable line of sight blocking in your deployment zone, you're just going to die. They're just going to kill half your army and the game's over already. Melee-focused armies have adapted so far in 9th edition to either be resilient in their own right enough to get up the table with or without mid-board level terrain, or fast enough that they can close the distance in 1 turn and they don't need to leapfrog between terrain. For example, an army like Death Guard is going to be able to deliver their melee units into the center of the table, just moving them towards objectives and being very difficult to take out at range. Things like Death Shroud Terminators are just going to waddle up the table. They don't really care about cover that much. They don't care about line of sight blocking, and with a threat saturation, your opponent doesn't necessarily have the beef to kill them and deal with the remainder of the Death Guard army before those Death Shrouds get committed. Tyranids or Harlequins or other versions of Eldari, for example, also are able to cross the distance between them and their opponent in 1 turn, especially with double movement effects, so they don't necessarily need to be too resilient on the way in because they can just immediately close there and be in melee anyway. Neither of those armies are going to win, however, if they don't have any line of sight blocking in their deployment zone and their opponent can just kill them. So while I do think some of this piece of this article is a little bit of marketing speak, I do get a little bit scared when Games Workshop continues to parrot this idea that, you know, terrain is good for close combat armies that want to go to the center of the table. And while that certainly is true, they don't dislike that. They want terrain in the middle that they can play around and hide behind. Most of the time, the importance of terrain is going to be so that you don't die if you go second. Now, they also talk about obscuring terrain in specific. I like that they call out some of the interactions of True Line of Sight, especially in 8th edition, as being gamey. Games Workshop, you wrote these rules. This is your fault, buddy. This feels like sort of a tacit admission that True Line of Sight is garbage, so it took you 10 years, GW, but I'm proud of you that we're finally getting to that. Given that the terrain features on here are essentially just walls glued to pieces of plexiglass, we're also kind of talking about how 2-dimensional style terrain, you know, might be the way of the future, which I think would be great. I love putting 3-dimensional things on top of 2-dimensional terrain, and that's essentially how these terrain features work, and I think that's phenomenal, so I hope that we can one day get to a set of rules where you don't actually have to have those 3-dimensional things, because that just smooths the game over. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have them. You should always have cool looking terrain on your table because that massively increases the experience of the game. But a game that's able to be treated as two-dimensional just plays more smoothly in general. Now, they also talk about the particular keywords that each of the terrain features have. We did talk about this when we originally talked about the rules pack. The large and small ruins all have the same keywords. The only difference is the size and the composition of the walls on the large ruins. All of them are scalable, breachable, light cover, defensible, and obscuring, whereas the small green pieces are essentially forests. They are also scalable, breachable, and defensible, but they also give you dense cover and have difficult ground. Now, one thing I do want to commend GW on is the placement of these dense terrain pieces. One thing that especially sort of newer board makers like to do, and let me tell you, I did this also when 9th edition first dropped. I made this gorgeous board that had a lot of dense cover on it, and they just smack them right in the middle. They go, hey, we're going to fight around these cool forests. They're going to be right in the middle here, and won't that be interesting? And the issue is that dense cover is really easy to get once it is applied in the center of the table, because basically if any part of your base is blocked by that line of fire between the attacker and the defender, then they get dense cover. So applying -1 to hit with a centrally located piece of dense cover, especially if there are a lot of them or they're very large, then that becomes very oppressive, especially for factions that are not good at playing around that dense cover. The article talked about Astra Militarum and Tau before, and I think those are the two primary examples. -1 to hit effects absolutely wreck both of those factions because their base ballistic skill is not that good, and they also don't have great access to rerolls. So if you put dense cover in the middle, that gives basically a lot of times their entire army -1 to hit, and that can absolutely neuter the damage output against almost anything in the game. It is very brutal. And so one mistake I see oftentimes is putting that dense cover in the center and making it this huge oppressive thing that's going to affect most of the game. But if you put it in the corners, it becomes an actual tactical decision whether or not you want to get it. First off, it's also difficult terrain, so you have to decide whether or not you want to go into the dense cover to get the dense cover benefits, or not suffer the -2 movement, which is fair. But also, it's in the corners, so you have to actually go seek it out. And remember, as per the dense cover keywords, as long as you're overlapping the zone even a little bit, you're going to get that dense cover benefit. So you can be putting tanks and large monsters and stuff right on the corners of the table here to get that -1 to hit. Not to mention the fact that these are areas of the table that are normally not going to be blocked by line of sight blockers, so you have to decide whether you're going to put your models in the sides here, behind these buildings, or out in the open but in dense cover. And I think that just creates a really interesting dynamic during deployment. I think this is almost exactly where you should be putting dense cover. You could push it up a little bit, maybe have it kind of filling this space here rather than being just specifically in the corners, but I think it's fine where it is. Now, last but not least, the article talks about the fairness of the terrain, and they cover here why the terrain is going to be symmetric. Now, this is probably the most controversial part of these terrain layouts, and that the community has been wrestling with since they got announced. A lot of people out there, are real stands for asymmetric terrain. Terrain, where the two sides are different and where the role to pick your table side becomes very impactful. Now, I also think that asymmetric terrain is very cool, and I do think that it has a place in 9th edition 40k. I think that if you have a terrain set up with very small but crucial differences between the two sides, where one side doesn't necessarily have a better layout than the other, but it might have some more advantageous positions. The two lists may interact with that terrain differently and in interesting ways. For example, you can have one side of the table have multiple line of sight blockers that are smaller and are porous, so you can see through them, versus the other side having one big wall. A player playing knights or something like that with large 18+ wounders who wouldn't be protected by the normal obscuring terrain might want the big, huge wall. But the other side would get more benefit from having the more numerous pieces of line of sight blocking terrain. On the flip side, you can have, one side have a larger ruin to protect your models, but the other side has a smaller ruin and some dense cover you can use. Those are interesting decisions that the players will have to consider when they're thinking out their deployment and choosing their deployment zone. Where asymmetric terrain becomes awkward is when the two sides are not balanced. And this happens, more often than you'd think. Somebody wants to set up a city, so they'll put a bunch of buildings on one side of the table and a bunch of trenches on the other side of the table. They say there's the same number of pieces of terrain on both sides. It'll be fine. In 8th edition, this actually wouldn't have been that much of an issue because the player choosing their deployment zone would have been going second. So the player who ostensibly got the worst deployment zone would be going first. So the player going second would choose the side with all the buildings, and they would deploy behind them. The player going first wouldn't have much cover, but it wouldn't matter because they would get the first opportunity to attack. They would move up to centrally located terrain, and they would take some table space, and it would end up being fine. The downside and the issue with that asymmetric terrain in 9th edition is that in 9th edition, the role to go first and the role to choose your table side are totally divorced. Those are two separate roles, and you could have a situation where one player gets to pick the good deployment zone and then also go first. So, for example, in the example that we gave, if there's a bunch of buildings on one side of the table and the player who wins the role to pick the deployment zone picks that side, then they win the role to go first. The other player's in a bunch of trenches. They don't have a lot of line of sight blocking. Maybe they're in light cover, but that doesn't typically tend to protect you too much. And the player going first has perfect positioning, blows them off the table, and kills them turn one. And that is the real danger of symmetrical terrain, especially in a competitive setting in Warhammer 40k. I'm actually a huge fan of the 8th edition style where the player who chose their deployment zone goes second and the player who deploys first goes first. I think that just makes for a more interesting game, a more dynamic game, and saves a lot of time during the game. I could spend a whole video talking about all of the reasons that method of deployment is better than what we have right now, but given the rule set that this event is working with, I think it is important to keep that terrain symmetric because of the fact that, one player could potentially win both roles and just blow out their opponent, and the game being then a non-competition. Now, another argument that gets parroted a lot of times when we talk about this asymmetric terrain is people talking about how, you're supposed to be able to adapt to different terrain setups, and if your opponent has the advantage in terrain, then you're supposed to be able to overcome them with some sort of strategy. But as we talked about earlier in the video, the goal of terrain isn't necessarily to, make the game more tactically fulfilling, although that certainly is, a potential effect of terrain, and I would hope one thing that you're trying to do when you're setting up terrain. The goal of terrain is to make sure you don't die on the top of turn one, and that's not something that you can play around. Like, if you set up your army and you have no cover and your opponent's going first and has 10 las cannons, there's no amount of tactical genius that's going to get you out of that situation. They're just going to shoot a bunch of las cannons at you, and they're just going to kill your army, and there's nothing you can do. There's no game action that's going to save you from that. While centrally located terrain that's very interesting and very diverse and, even asymmetric certainly can create those interesting tactical problems, when you're talking about terrain to defend you in your deployment zone, there is no substitute for symmetric terrain that's relatively dense. Maybe in GT 2022, we see a deploy first, go first system, and we can start introducing some more interesting and varied terrain setups, but right now, those are the rules that GW wants to use, and I am glad that they're electing to build terrain setups that are appropriate for those deployment rules. Now, they also talked about how large models are supposed to be able to move from one side of the table to the other, at least on some avenues, unencumbered. One thing that I am a little bit worried about is that that's going to be kind of tough, especially when we look at the physical pictures. It looks to me like large models may be a little hindered by this terrain. Now, remember that you can move through, if you have a big base, you can move over the edges of the terrain features here. Those don't pose a problem, but you can't move through the walls of the ruin, or if you do, you'd have to move over them as long as you don't end on top of them, which can add a ridiculous amount to your movement. And going down the sides here ends you getting stuck in difficult terrain for a turn or two, which could be, equally problematic. In conjunction with the fact that none of this terrain is going to block line of sight to 18 wounders, I am a little worried about the viability of large, big stompy robots and monsters in these terrain setups. I do think that this terrain might be a little toxic to those large Titanic units. You can finagle ways to get around the table, but it's going to be very difficult, and your opponent's going to be shooting you from behind a building the entire time. That said, just the way 9th edition works is already pretty toxic to those large models, and you have to have fly or some very impressive stats to justify being brought already. Because the game is so reliant on obscuring terrain to keep armies safe from those alpha strikes, it does end up being a lot of ruins in the center of the table in 9th edition games, and that means that those large units will have difficulty getting through. I don't think that necessarily torpedoes their ability to win with these setups, but I do think it's something to keep in mind if you're thinking about taking some large units like Knights, like big monsters, like Primarchs to an event that's using these terrain layouts. Now, before we close out the video, I do want to take a little bit more of an in-depth look at these terrain layouts, as I've actually created sort of a facsimile of them on Tabletop Simulator. I'll put links down to my Steam Workshop account in the video description, but what I wanted to touch on was the balance of these terrain layouts and exactly how they're going to play out. If you're a YouTube channel member or a member of the Patreon and you have access to the Advanced Tactics series, I will be going over these terrain layouts in depth as they relate to each of the missions in the GT 2021 pack. I think that's going to be an interesting discussion. We're going to dive really super in depth into, the optimal deployment and how to play out the game on each of those missions with these terrain layouts. So you can be prepared if you go to an event that uses them. If you're interested in like really sort of ludicrously in-depth Warhammer 40k tactics topics, then you can go check out that series. You can just join in the channel membership button down below, or by hopping on at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise. Now, it's my opinion that each of these layouts has a particular deployment zone that they're going to be optimal on, and I think this is map 1 here, so we can see that we have the 4 ruins located sort of equidistant in the center, creating these 2 big alleyways through the middle of the table. And in my opinion, the right angles that these buildings are at makes it a little bit better for either these Dawn of War style deployments with the long table edge, or more of a hammer and anvil style deployment with the short table edge. That gives these ruins the ability to block the maximum amount of line of sight and protect you the most from alpha strikes. Now, long table edge deployments are always the most awkward because they have the greatest surface area out of any deployment type, and that does make it so that alpha strikes are very possible. So let's talk about exactly how much line of sight blocking these terrain features will give you. Now, assuming that you aren't going to be quite able to move into this terrain and see through it, you're basically going to be looking at a line of sight that looks like this, since you'll be blocked by the corner of this thing over to the corner of the other terrain piece. And your line of sight going back would look something like that. We can also see that if you're off on the side, we would see a line like this. On the flip side, these terrain pieces do actually do a lot to block line of sight to crossfire. It's very difficult to get a shot from one quarter of the table to the other because you do have the diagonals of all of these big terrain features in there. So you can see the safest places to be on the table are going to be right behind this deployment zone, somewhere in here. This is sort of where you have to hide, but in that area where the line of sight isn't blocked, you do have that dense cover that, again, we can put monsters or vehicles in just with their toe in the back, and they'll be able to get -1 to be hit, which will protect them a little bit. Looking at this layout, I'm actually a little bit happier with how it is going to block line of sight than I was initially. I think a lot of people were scared that the lines of fire would be relatively open on these maps, and while for sure, if you are like an Iron Strider Ballistarius and you can move 16 inches and you can get in the side here, you do have a lot more freedom than you would normally. I think a lot of times these are going to be just fine. I will say that super fast stuff, or aircraft especially, is going to be brutal on these maps because there's not really any true line of sight blockers, especially to aircraft, so all they have to do is like move up, toe onto the corner of this thing, and they're going to be able to see through almost everything in here. I have very little faith that these line of sight blockers are going to be big enough to block line of sight to aircraft, so that will be weird, but that is basically how aircraft have worked since time immemorial, so that's not really a huge change. So let's actually pop in my Tyranid list here. This is a list that requires a lot of terrain to be functional and to survive turn 1, because Tyranid models are not particularly difficult to kill. And things are a little tight, but it's not sort of the end of the world. We can fit, essentially, we can put our Hive Guard unit hiding in a corner here, something like this. We can also probably fit 2 to 3 of my Hive Tyrant equivalents in the corners as well. And then I think we can fit the 20 Gene Stealers. And that's about the maximum of what you can fit in a position where they're going to be, spawn a bunch of dice packs in, where they're going to be protected. That does mean that both players are going to have to put some stuff out of line of sight. I think that's fine. I think as much as it is important to have really good terrain to survive those alpha strikes, I don't think that players should be able to 100% hide their armies, at least without, forcing your opponent to go through some gymnastics. This does mean that anything besides these these core units are going to be left out in the cold, but you do have that dense cover that you can use potentially to protect those big tanky monsters or vehicles. So this is, I think this is probably fine for as a level of terrain. You also have a little bit of true line of sight blocking by these things, and especially as you move up the table to hold these objectives, you can be able to hide infantry units up in there, something like that. And that these will certainly protect small infantry or vehicle units just fine with the true line of sight blocking. Obviously, you can't really see much through there. So overall, I'm pretty happy with this layout. We can take a look at layout number 2. Now, to me, layout number 2 looks a little bit more designed for these corner-style deployments. So either the diagonal deployments or the ones where you just have a corner like sweep and clear. That's because we do have these angled buildings in the center that are going to be able to block a lot of the easy lines of fire across the middle. Now, that said, these deployments are very difficult, again, to stop a lot of times because you have really, really good... And with that really large, wide frontage on your deployment zone, it's a lot easier to get weird angles around. So, for example, you know, obviously we can see on this side, these areas in the side here are not going to be protected whatsoever. Your opponent's going to be able to literally just deploy behind this building, move laterally or move into the building, and get line of sight through here. So this back corner is very dangerous to deploy in. That said, you do have the buildings in a pretty solid positions to protect your units. But I am a little bit worried about the position of these smaller buildings in the front, because anything fast enough is going to be able to hide in them. And because they have so many windows and breaches in them, it's going to be relatively easy to get line of sight through. You could potentially block line of sight between the two buildings, something like this, and that makes your lines of fire look like that. Now, that said, you do still have some pretty reasonable line of sight blocking between these buildings. You can essentially be hiding in here or in here, and those are relatively difficult to get at. The area, the danger zone that's in the middle here, you again have that dense cover that you can hide behind, and if your opponent's getting those shots along the angle here, you're almost always in dense cover thanks to this piece of terrain. That said, I do think that you can hide a bunch of stuff in this deployment zone, despite the fact that this is typically one of the easiest deployments to get line of sight to your opponent's models on. And if we do the Tyranid test here, we'll see how much we can hide in this deployment. And I think the answer is going to be actually quite a bit. So we can actually see that I can deploy almost my entire army in these two shadow zones, at least for this Tyranid army. These poor Sky Slasher swarms that had to end up being deployed out. But there is going to be a lot of true line of sight blocking with these big walls. You can only really see them from this angle. And even then, the line of sight gets awkward because of this ruin. So this is actually going to be relatively defensive, even if you can move in to see these. So I do think that this is actually kind of a pretty appropriate level of line of sight blocking. If you do see some lateral movements like this, we could see this coverage shrink a little bit depending on how your opponent deploys. So you could see this line of sight actually looking something like that, right? Maybe something like that. And that means that, you know, you'd have to basically sacrifice an exocrine and put it out in the open, or maybe both exocrines and put them in dense cover. But that's not the end of the world, really. So I do think that these are some pretty appropriate layouts, especially for this deployment. Now, where things get awkward is when you start talking about using this for other deployments. And that's why I said that I thought that the idea would be to use these for a single method of deployment, because while this does block a reasonable amount of line of sight just because of the size of the buildings, it doesn't do it with quite the same reliability that the other one does. Obviously, there's no line of sight blockers in the sides here to stop you from getting lines of sight through this area, so you can expect that the coverage of this side ends up looking like this, although some of that's going to be through dense cover potentially, and then the same on this side, especially if your opponent's like move 6 and is able to move up a little bit on the first turn. These are going to be relatively easy to jump into, especially this one, so that's not really going to protect you. Your maximum line of sight blocking is going to maybe look something like that, I think. And while that does give you a little bit of coverage, it's certainly not the same, not as reliable as the other version, and your crossfire looks a little bit better. You know, we have lines across the entire table that look like that. We also, you know, that gets even worse if you can jump into the ruins in the center, and you're going to be able to see through those really easily. I don't think this is the end of the world if you end up playing a long table deployment on this one, but I don't think it's particularly good. Now, a similar thing starts to happen if you end up putting the diagonal deployment zone on table 1 like we have here. This actually becomes really awkward because your line of sight is very inconsistent. And this is, I think, probably the worst combination of the two styles of deployment. So I think the big issue is that this building becomes very easy to walk into and touch. It looks like it's only about 6-ish inches away from the other player's deployment zone, meaning if they have any guns that are fast at all, they can move up and start shooting through windows and shooting through little things in this area. The article does mention that these are essentially true line of sight blocking, but because of just how GW terrain works, that's not always the case. These big walls, there's going to be 2 to 3 layers of walls that will be relatively easy to hide behind, but any other portion of the terrain is going to be essentially barren and empty because you're going to be able to get some line of sight. You can't really rely on those to be your line of sight blockers, which means if your opponent's able to get up and touch these on turn 1, that's not going to help you at all. You basically just have like this piece that's going to block you. We can look at that essentially being the angle if this wall is blocking line of sight. And on this side, we have something like this, and then your opponent could deploy here, move out, and get a line that looks like that. So while you have a little bit of a shadow zone here, it's not particularly reliable, especially if you have larger monsters or vehicles that will probably be able to get seen through these walls or around these walls. And on this side of the table, you have like just this one little tiny narrow corridor. So I think the most dangerous setup to me would be this diagonal style deployment on map number 1, and I think that is probably something that the design team is going to be avoiding. I do think a lot of the other setups that we talked about in this video are going to be relatively effective, and I do think that there is some flexibility to these layouts. The more I think about it, the more I'm interested to play with these layouts, because I do think that they're actually, you know, they're not too bad, especially if you use them, you know, judiciously with the mission and deployment styles that they were intended for. I think that really there's some interesting play around them, and they're definitely something to consider if we're looking at the standardization of terrain across a large number of big Warhammer 40,000 competitive events. Now, the article did mention something else about the issue of objectives being inside defensible terrain. There is a rule, obviously, in GT 2021 where objectives cannot be placed overlapping defensible terrain or obstacles. That sort of speaks to me of how the original design team thought that defensible was going to be a much bigger deal than it ends up being. You're slightly better at receiving charges, but typically the goal of a charging unit is to kill you. So you're not going to be charging if you're not reliably going to kill most of the unit that you're charging at. So the +1 to hit in melee doesn't really do much, and the +1 to hit in Overwatch only matters if you're overwatching, which does work sometimes, but it really requires a lot of setup. And they've just decided to sort of waive that here, which I think is very appropriate. With these big 12 by 12 inch blocks of defensible terrain on the table, there would really be no getting around the fact that objectives sometimes have to be in there, and they said, it's fine. There's a clause that says if you can't move the terrain, then you can put the objective in it, and we're just going to say that that's the rule. So there you go. You know, maybe GT 2022, that's another change we see. But anyway, that's all I had to say about these new US Open map layouts. I'm actually really excited to see the impact that they have on competitive 40k. It's going to be a real big deal to see how the first US Open event goes down in Orlando in August. I'm so excited to see how GW approaches running an event. I know they were hiring new staff for this event and new events coordinators that were experienced with esports and competitive play, and I hope that we see a real big, you know, exciting competition from this. The jury's still out on whether the metagame can support, you know, a highly competitive event like that, and I do think that there are some issues with the US Open format that I talked about in my previous video. I think the bracket format is actually really toxic, especially to an ITC ranked event, but those may be iterations that we see changed in the future. The real big question that I've harped on several times in the video is whether or not the changes and the rules that are coming out of US Open are going going to be adopted by the rest of the community. And I'm all for community standardization. I think that that would be phenomenal. That gives everyone more of a consistent experience when they're interacting with competitive 40k, and I think that's only good for the game, as long as that consistent experience is a good one. But until next time, that's going to be it for today. Big thanks to my patrons over patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, also YouTube channel members and Twitch subscribers. All those people are phenomenal. They help support the channel. They help me do what I do. Please come hang out with me for the T5S2 Invitational starting this Friday. And remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.